deals with issues of agriculture. And we have an interesting paper by Andrew Foster and Mark Rosenzweig asking whether Indian farms are too small, whether efficiency rises with size. And one of the authors, Professor Mark Rosenzweig of Yale University, is here to sketch the argument. Mark.
Okay. Thank you. Let me get this appropriate view. Control L. Okay. So let me begin by relating what I'm going to do to the discussion that we had in the earlier session, where we began to wrestle with one point about India that people have recognized, which is the slow movement of the population out of rural areas into urban areas. And what I want to draw your attention to is not so much what the causes are, but what the consequences are for rural agriculture. And it's going to be related to scale. And basically what we're going to do is look again at what was an old issue about Indian agriculture, which is about the scale of farming in India. Now, whether the major reason that people have not moved out of agriculture is the lack of industrialization or policies that are focused on subsidizing the rural population, such as the Rural Employment Scheme, or whether it's due to the indigenous existence of rural insurance schemes provided by family and caste, the fact is that there has been a slow amount of movement out of the rural areas. 58% of the population the labor force is working in agriculture in India. And the Indian agriculture is underperforming in terms of growth relative to the growth rate of the rest of India. So we want to take a look, and the hypothesis that we're going to be looking at is the lack of movement out of agriculture is one of the major reasons that Indian agriculture is underperforming in the world. That in fact, movement out of agriculture, accompanied by consolidation of land holdings, would enormously improve the productivity of Indian agriculture. So it's not like the old surplus labor models of development that old-timers used to study, in which the idea was that there could be movements out of agriculture without a drop in output. This, in fact, is going to say that movement of people out of agriculture would actually improve agricultural productivity and output. Okay? So we want to look at this issue. And let me start by putting in perspective agriculture in the world and looking at India in that perspective. So viewed across countries of the world where agriculture is very productive, there are three characteristics of agriculture. One is that farms are still family farms. They're still family owned. They're not corporations, although they might, in fact, legally be that structure, but they're basically ma and pa firms. But secondly, they're very large scale. And third, they're highly mechanized, using very little labor. If you look at agriculture in OECD countries, some parts of Brazil now, and certainly the United States, those are the features you see. Now we compare Indian agriculture in that picture, and we see, of course, it's family farms, for sure, okay? But it's very small scale. And I think a lot of people, not probably this audience, but a lot of people in the world who study development don't appreciate how small the scale is. So 68% of farms are less than 2 acres. That means that many of my colleagues in the economics department of Yale own more land than most farmers in India do, and they're not farming. So 85% are less than 5 acres. And in terms of mechanization, until recently, the farms were really not mechanized. And I can show you with a graph, first of all, the distribution of land. This is from the most recent data that we could find, the 2005 Indian Human Development Survey. This is the cumulative distribution, which just basically shows what I said. You can see that, that less than 85% are less than 5 acres. But more importantly is mechanization. So we have a data set that was originated in the National Council of Applied Economic Research in Delhi in India, which was a survey of all rural households in India starting in 1969-70 crop season. And there have been follow-ups in the same villages and the same households since then, up through 2007. That's the data that we're going to be using to examine these issues. But one thing we can do is we can look at the relationship between the fraction of farms by farm size that own a tractor or a powered thresher. And the bottom line there is the situation in 1970. And you can see that by and large, less than 5% of farms owned a tractor or a powered thresher. That's that bottom discontinuous line. And that it didn't really differ very much across farm scale. Okay. Then we moved to 1998, jumped to 1998, same villages, basically the same households. And we see there was a slight movement up in mechanization, but basically it's fairly flat over the whole distribution. But by the time we get to 2007, the situation has changed. And for farms over at 20 acres, we have almost 25% of farms with mechanized equipment, as opposed to, though, about 10% in the smaller farms. Okay, so there's a new phenomenon of increased mechanization, but it's very scale related in India now. Okay, so that's just description. So what we want to ask is, as in the title, are small Indian farms efficient? They're certainly small. Okay, are they too small? And where are they small? What kind of scale are we talking about to improve productivity? Now, as I said, there's an old literature going back a long time looking at this question about scale economies in agriculture. And it has three deficiencies that we see. First of all, the estimates are old. They're estimated from data that characterized Indian agriculture in the 1970s when there was hardly any mechanization. So there can be no role of what mechanization can do to improve agricultural productivity. Okay. Secondly, and as I'll show, quite importantly, the kinds of computations that were made to try to calculate farm productivity using farm profits, which seems like a reasonable thing to do, made unrealistic assumptions about the opportunity cost of labor, about the value of labor, about the shadow price of labor. One of the major measures of efficiency was simply output per acre. And the basic finding was that output per acre actually declined as land size increased. And this made people start to say, hurrah, small agriculture is good agriculture. And Indian small farmers are the fruit of the earth. But of course, this measure of productivity is basically valuing labor at zero, which of course might be in accord with surplus labor models, and was certainly in accord, for example, a very famous model of Amartya Sen in the late 1960s, in which he had all households being autarkic, there had no labor market whatsoever. Right? So maybe zero is okay, but that's what they were doing. But of course, anyone who was looking at Indian data, even in the 70s, was seeing agricultural wages in India, was noticing that at harvest time there was lots of hiring of labor. It was sort of unrealistic to think of the cost of labor being zero. Other people then said, all right, we'll use our standard labor models that we learned in economics, and we'll look at the market wage, and we'll value the labor at the market wage. And when they did this, they found that most of Indian agriculture was unprofitable. When you subtracted out the labor costs from profits, you ended up with negative profits. Okay? But this is also unrealistic, because it ignores a very important point that everyone talked about in the theoretical literature, we all learned, which is agency cost. That is to say, you need to supervise labor. And as you use more hired labor, your demands for supervision go up. And once you take into account supervision, then the market wage understates the value, the cost of labor. Okay? But nobody dealt with this. And the question then is, what is the relevant opportunity cost of labor for properly valuing the productivity of agriculture in India? Okay? And we're going to show you how to do this. And the third, of course, is that when they looked at the relationship between land and output, however that's measured, of course, they weren't looking at a massive randomization experiment in which people had randomly allocated different types of land to see what would happen to productivity. Land was not randomly allocated, and it could be that small farms are located where the quality of land is good, and big farms are where the quality of land is bad, or vice versa, right? Or it could be that owners of large farms are particularly interested and productive, or the opposite. Owners of large farms were absentee landlords who didn't care about agriculture, right? So just looking at the relationship between whatever the measure of output is and land size is not going to answer the causal question of if we made farm size bigger or smaller through some kind of policy, what would happen to agricultural output. Okay. So we're going to take a new look at this issue with new data at modern Indian agriculture, which is partly mechanized. Okay. And we have, now, why can we do this better, we think? Is it because we're smarter than the people who did it fast? No, not at all. We have much better data. Okay. And we have data that looks at households over time. We have data at the plot level. And I'm going to show you we can use that to make some inferences about productivity and scale. But also we do have a theoretical framework that helps us understand this issue of how to value labor. Okay. So we're going to use a theoretical framework, and I won't go into the details of it for this audience, that's going to incorporate a number of features that need to be incorporated that haven't been before together. Okay, there have been individual models that have emphasized credit costs, agency costs, and other things, but they haven't put them together, and they certainly haven't used the right data to empirically operationalize them. So one of the models is going to incorporate the need for supervision. The fact that hired labor is more costly than, in actual fact, than family labor because of the need for supervision, whatever the wage rate is in the market. Two, we're going to incorporate the fact that getting credit is, we have more access to credit when you have collateral, and land is good collateral. So they're falling credit costs with owned land holdings that a lot of models have featured. We'll look at whether that's true, but the model will allow for that. And then third, we're going to take seriously the properties of mechanization. And one of the properties of mechanization is that it's very scale dependent. The productivity of mechanized agriculture is directly related to the scale of operations. And the easiest way to think of that as a harvester. You have a 2-row harvester, you have a 4-row harvester, you have an 8-row harvester. And an 8-row harvester can harvest a lot more corn or wheat per unit of time than a 2-row harvester. And guess what? If you've got a tiny slot of land, you can't use an 8-row harvester. Right? So there's a simple mechanical relationship, as it were, between the scale economies of mechanization and scale that we're going to build into the model. And just to illustrate this point, first we looked at the published specifications of Indian-produced combines. So these are combines that are made in India, one of the industries that would actually grow if Indian agriculture became larger. And this graph shows you the amount of harvested hectares per hour by the weight of the different devices. We could do it by volume, but weight and volume are basically the same, or size. And you can see for both rice harvesters and wheat harvesters, there's a direct relationship between the size of the machine and the productivity of the machine. But to illustrate things even more literally, we found photographs of different machines that harvested rice across different agricultural areas of the world. Okay? And here's the photograph. In the upper left, we see something familiar. This is rice harvesting or rice production in India, Nepal. Okay? To the right of that, we see what rice harvesting looks at in many areas of the Philippines. Below that, in some other countries. And the bottom right panel is rice harvesting in California. Okay? And you can see the differences in the size of the machines that are being used. And I can tell you there's a direct positive relationship between the productivity of rice agriculture and the size of those machines that we see observationally in the world. Okay? So that's the aspect of mechanization that we want to also incorporate in the way we look at the world. Right? Now, a key product of the model is that it tells us how to properly evaluate and what data we need to measure the opportunity cost of labor. And the principal thing you need to do is to look at what labor is being used for each stage of operation in agriculture. And everyone who studied agriculture knows that there are stages of operation that are sequential. In our data, we have 7 stages, and each one has a different set of people that are being organized even in the same farm. Okay? And so the opportunity, I was going to show you the opportunity cost of labor is actually going to differ across stages of operation, which means to do this right, you need to have very detailed data. All right, now what we're going to exploit as well in terms of dealing with the issue that land is not distributed in somebody's notion of a randomized experiment is something that we're all familiar with in Indian agriculture, which is partible inheritance. That the major reason that there are changes in land size and operational scale is not through land sales or purchases, but rather through the division of households, mostly at the time of the death of the head. In our survey rounds, we're going to use the last two rounds of the survey. 20% of households divided. That's over a 9-year period. So the same family at the beginning of the period, right, was operating a farm much larger than they were at the end of the period for 20% of the households. And we can ask, what happened to productivity when the land was split? Sort of the experiment we'd like to perform, right? For the same household, right? Divided up into smaller parts. We're also going to exploit another feature of our data is that many farms, land is divided up into plots. And the plots are of different size. And those plots of different size are mostly due to what they inherited. They're not because they went through and consolidated land holdings. So for the same farmer, we're going to compare the productivity of a larger plot versus a smaller plot. We'll have to take into account that they differ in quality, and we'll do that as well. Okay, so these are the two things in the data that we can exploit. So what we're going to be able to do is we're going to be able to obtain estimates of farm size effects. We call them marginal here, but what we mean is, for a given farm size, how much would profits per acre increase or decrease if we added one more acre to that farm at different points in the distribution? So if we take a 1-acre farm and we add an acre, what happens to profits per acre? We take a 20-acre farm, which is very big by Indian standards, and add 1 acre of land, what happens to profits per acre? And we'll look at that over the entire distribution. So what we're saying is the effects of scale may be nonlinear, and we're going to see to what extent that is true. And we're going to look at these effects of farm size on profits per acre, on labor intensity, on mechanization, on the returns to mechanization, and we're going to be able also to predict what a farmer would pay if there were no constraints in the market for renting an additional unit of land. And we're going to be able to compare that to actual rental rates in the economy. See, if our estimates are really nutty or not. Okay? Because we have in our data as well information on what rental rates are for land. Okay. So that's basically what we're going to do. And as I said, we need actually to start off with a theoretical model, not because there's some requirement at Yale that you must have a theoretical model to do empirical work, but as I will tell you without going through the operations, in fact, without this model, you wouldn't have a clue as to how to evaluate labor. And the model is also going to spit out tests of whether there are credit market constraints. So it's actually helpful in showing us what we need, what data we need, and what we do with the data in order to figure out what's going on. Okay? So again, this is not the place to step through all of the features of the model, but let me just point out what some of the components are. Okay? So first of all, as I said, we have to build in this realistic idea that there are stages of production. So our model clearly has to have multiple stages. Okay? We're going to conceptualize the idea that each of these operations has associated with it work to be done. So for example, if it's a weeding operation, it's take the weeds out. Okay? And this work to be done can be carried out by labor or machines, or a combination of the two. Right? So that's sort of this work. This equation one is just basically there's a work function. And fertilizer might contribute to some of the other stages of production as well. And everything's going to be on a per acre basis. Right? So that's sort of the first feature. And this work technology that relates these inputs to getting the task done has as inputs machinery, which varies by capacity. This is another important feature. A machine is not a machine. They're all different, as in those photographs showed you. So if I just say rice harvester, that's not good enough, right? Is it the rice harvester in the Philippines or the rice harvester that you saw in the picture for the United States? Well, farmers can choose, right? You can now choose an Indian harvester that There's multiple rows of different dimensions, as I showed you. Okay? Manual labor and machinery services are imperfect substitutes, so you could weed with a machine or you could weed with a person. And possibly, as those specifications suggested, the productivity of labor, but mostly of machines, are going to depend on the scale of operations. There's also costs, so that we observe. There's a rental market for machines, and you pay a rent that depends on the type of machine you rent. Obviously, it's related to the price of rental. Again, there's no machine rental. There's a rental for a particular type of machine, which has different capacities. So that's built in to the model. We specify what that schedule of prices might look like with respect to capacity. There is a rental market for labor. There is a market wage for labor. You can see that in the data, but I'll be more specific about that soon. Okay? And of course, labor can be supplied by hiring people in or by the family. Right? That's realistic. But, and here's the realism as well, all laborers must be supervised by family members, by operators. Now, some people always assume you only hired laborers need supervision. But anyone who's ever worked with a child knows that it's not true that children don't need supervision, right? It's just a question of who needs more supervision, the hired labor or the family labor. And we're going to estimate these supervision coefficients to see. So then there's the supervision function, right? We don't go through the details. And then equation 4 is just basically saying that a family member is going to spend his time supervising, working in manual labor, on the own farm, off the farm, and also in producing home goods, or leisure, however you want to put it. And there's a time constraint. That's all that's saying. So that's all built in, just to show you the elements seem reasonable. All right, so let's get right to it. What is the appropriate shadow price of labor, given we observe market wages W for each operation? All right. So what we can show, it's obvious, that there are 3 regimes in any stage of production. The first regime is that only family labor is used in the farm operation, and family members are also selling their time in the market. So they're working on their own farm, and they're also working on someone else's farm, or in some other activity, off the farm for a wage rate, W. Okay? There's a second regime in which hired workers are employed on the farm. So it's a combination of hired workers and family workers. And then there's a third regime of autarky, where family members are working on the farm, but they're not working off the farm. Right? So it's just working on the farm. And what we show is that the shadow price of labor is different in each regime. And what regime a farm is in is going to differ by stage. So for example, as I already mentioned, at harvest time, you observe in almost all households that they hire labor, even very small farms. There's a lot of work to be done in a very short period of time. But in the plow operations, for the most part, it's done by family labor, right? So it's different by stages. But it turns out then that the shadow price of labor is going to be different depending on what regime you're in and what stage you're in. They're different across stages. And the shadow price of labor is never W, even though the rental market is assumed to work perfectly. If you need labor, you can buy it at W. If you want to sell your labor, you can sell it at W. Without taking into account any other constraints, it's still not the right rental price. And so we show, working out the model, what the appropriate rental price is, and here they are. Okay? So in the first regime, that's the regime in which only family labor is employed, and then family members sell their remaining time in the labor market. The shadow price of labor on that farm is not W, but 1 plus the supervision coefficient times W. Now, why is that? I can give you the intuition for this one. It's basically that if you increase your time working by 1 more day, right, you also increase the amount of supervision time by this amount S, right? So the wage is not just the wage of that manual labor, but it's also the wage of the person supervising you, right? And the wage is anchored by the fact that you're also working off the farm. Regime 2, where they're hiring labor, there's the formula there. It's pretty clear that if the family requires less supervision than hired labor, that W2, which is in that regime 2 where you're hiring labor, is higher than W1. So in those times where hired labor is used, the shadow price of labor is higher than in those times when you're using only family labor. And then the third regime of autarky, we can show that the shadow price of labor is between the two. It's bounded below by the regime 1 wage, and it's bounded by above from the higher labor wage. But it's endogenously determined by preferences and other things. So it's actually a trickier regime, but as I'll show you, it's actually not an important regime in India. Okay, so then once we have the shadow prices, we can actually compute profits. Okay, and that's given by the formula, which basically just costs out labor and all the other inputs, taking into account the work functions and everything else. And what we can compute from this is the reservation rental price, okay, which is actually says something very simple. Okay. So the price that you would pay for an additional acre of land clearly depends on the profitability of that land you're buying, fine. Okay. But it also adds to the scale of your entire operation. Okay. So it actually then affects the productivity of the land you already own. Okay. So that's why it has two components. One is the value basically of what you're buying in terms of its profitability, but how it affects the rest of your operation by increasing scale, which could be lowering it or raising it, right? The model is actually agnostic so far on what's going to happen, okay? So we get that from the model, and we can compute that from our data with the appropriate information, okay? All right, so where are positive scales? I mean, you know where I'm going here, right? I'm going to show you that there's big positive scale economies. So where are they coming from? I've already shown you that the cost of hired labor is higher than the cost of family labor, and clearly small farms are more likely to be hiring family labor, and I'll show you that, right? So that's not a source of positive scale economies at all. There has to be something offsetting this. And it's going to come from mechanization. I've already given the explanation for that. And it's going to come from the credit markets, where owning large amounts of land is going to reduce your credit costs per acre. So the rest of the model is dealing with this, okay? And I won't go through these points except to say that the two advantages of scale are going to come from the machine capacity scale economies and are going to come from the credit market, okay? So it behooves us to, in fact, show you that these actually exist in the data, right? Once we appropriately compute profits, take into account the agency costs associated with using hired labor that favors small farms. Right? We want to give a break to small farms. That is their advantage. Okay, so that goes through this, and again, I won't go through the details, but basically these equations are building in those things that I said. Okay, and we get a test of credit market imperfections, which essentially is saying that the returns to capital are going to decline, are going to be zero if there are no credit market constraints. And they're not going to be zero if there are, and we can see to what extent the scale of operation affects the return to capital. It predicts if there are these credit market advantages, as well as scale economies, that the return to capital should decline as scale increases. The efficient return to capital should be zero once you take into account interest costs. You know, whatever the interest costs are, you should drive down the cost of the return to capital to equal those interest rates. Okay? So once they're taken into account, it should be essentially zero. Okay, so we can test for that too. All right, so this all sounds reasonable, but the demands, what it tells us, the demands on data are enormous. Having information at the stage level and at the plot level for farms is required. Okay, so what are we going to use? As I've mentioned, we're going to use 2 rounds from the Rural Economic Development Survey that the National Council of Applied Economic Research started in the late 60s and has been modified since then each round by Andrew Foster and myself and members of the staff at NCAR. And we're going to look at the last 2 rounds, 99 and 2007, 2008. Now, what is this survey? So it represents rural households in 242 villages in 17 major states of India. It just excludes Assam and J&K. They were there in the original survey, but they're hard to go into now to do surveys, or they were, depending on what year you go in. Okay, so these are basically the 5th and 6th rounds of this panel survey. The original in the late 60s was meant to be representative of the whole rural population of India, but by the time we get to 2007-8, staying in those same villages, that's no longer true. Okay? We're not going to be making any statements about what's true for India from these data, but rather the relationships between farm scale and productivity should be independent of whether it's representative of India, not in terms of the distribution of land. The relationship should be the same. Okay. It provides comprehensive inputs and outputs that we need. There's village level information on markets and facilities like banks and credit institutions. And we also know they link households across time. So we know a household in 2007, 2008, or a couple of households were once one household back in 2009. We watch where the splits occur. Okay, so there's 4 types of information that we use in our analysis from these data that I've started to hint at. One is the panel information for plots. So in the last round of the data, everything was collected at the plot level over 3 seasons. So we observed for some farmers the same plot 3 different times. Okay? That's the panel of plots, as it were. We also have retrospective histories for each of the farmers in 2008, where we ask them about their history of acquisitions of equipment and land since 1999. Okay? Then we have an actual panel of farm households, where we look at the households in 1999 and follow them over time to 2007, 2008. Okay? And then finally, we have a comprehensive listing of all households in each of these 242 villages. So we have 120,000 households represented. Okay, so it's very rich data to look at stuff. Okay. All right, so it's clear what we want to do. I've mentioned what the challenges are, that we repeat them, right? That land is not land. Land differs a lot, particularly in India. The land ownership that people have is not something magically given to them, but represents perhaps, it may be related to unobserved things that affect productivity we have to worry about. Another challenge is we'd really like to disentangle pure scale effects associated with mechanization from credit market effects. And one of the reasons for that is that the land rental market can correct scale effects. That is, if you have a small farm, in principle you could rent more land. But renting land doesn't give you a credit market advantage. Buying land does. Okay? So understanding whether the scale economies come from credit market advantages or from the ability to use more efficient machines is actually important to this issue. Okay? Well, I'll show you what the extent of the tenancy market is in India, which is rather small. Okay. Okay, so I've already mentioned we're going to exploit plot level differences within the same farmer. We're going to exploit changes in land ownership for the same household due to division. So again, over this 9-year period, this is quite amazing, and many people don't realize this. You know, well, many people. The land market is basically non-existent in India. It's very thin. There's no sale, but there's a lot of changes in land ownership coming from division. So 19% of farmers inherited land over 9 years, but less than 3% bought or sold land over the same 9 years, right? So the inheritance is the main force here. Okay, and I mentioned that we're going to look at these scale effects. Fine. And then we have to compute, first step, we got to compute the shadow price of labor, right? Yes, how much time? What?
You should be trying to accelerate things.
I can do that, but just tell me the end time that you want.
Well, why not make it
5 minutes?
Exactly, 5 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. So the first thing we have to do is we have to estimate the supervision function. How much time is required for supervision for family and hired labor? Okay, so we're going to do that. Okay? And I won't go into the methodology, but basically what we find is the following. The supervision coefficient for family labor is 1/4 the supervision coefficient for hard labor, right? That's in accord to what we think. And when we compute the shadow wages, the shadow price of a hired labor is double the shadow price of a family labor, right? So the data are throwing out for us, you know, what we all think are true, that there is this advantage to being small, okay? So now we want to know, so now we can compute profits correctly. We have all the stages and the prices of labor. Okay. So what we want to look at, and I'll just show you the graph, a couple of things. So you want to know what is the relationship between what regime a farm is in and its scale of operation. Remember, there are these 3 regimes: hiring labor in, using only family labor, no hiring out or in. Okay? And this graph is going to show you that. Okay, so the bottom axis is number of acres, owned land. Okay? And the lines are telling you, for each of the 3 regimes, the proportion of farms that are in each of the regimes. Okay? The bottom discontinuous line is that autarkic regime, And you can see two things. It's only 10%. It's relatively trivial, and it doesn't differ by scale. Okay, so let's ignore it. Okay. The key one is the top one, which is the regime in which they're hiring labor, and you can see that increases, as you might expect. The fraction of farms hiring in labor increases with scale. Not a surprise. No one's going to win a prize for that discovery. Okay? And the fraction of farms that only use family labor, which is the bottom continuous line, falls, okay, over the whole operational scale. Okay. So, fine. What happens to labor use per acre? So, labor is more expensive for the larger farms because they're using hired labor more. Okay? And what this graph shows you over the same distribution of land sizes is that labor per acre, appropriately adjusted for gender and age, declines precipitously with scale. So larger farms are using much less labor per acre than smaller farms.
Man-days per year.
Man-days per acre per year. Yes, exactly. Okay. All right, so now, what about profits? So here we go. The top line is simply gross output per acre. The top line shows you that for farms less than 2 acres, it actually does decline with scale. So that's in accord with what a lot of people find. That's 10%. That's a large fraction of farms. That's 68% of farms for which you find that, right? So that looks good, right? But now when you appropriately cost out labor, okay, you find the bottom lines, which is that over the full range of the distribution of farm sizes in India, valuing labor appropriately, taking into account supervision costs and everything else, profits per acre rise with farm scale. Okay? All right, and it's not sensitive to different ways of doing it, in fact. Okay, so what else can we say? Let me show you the effects of how these effects of scale affect profits per acre by landholding size. So this is how much adding an acre to a farm increases profits per acre. And you can see for the smallest farms, towards 0, less than 2, the adding an additional acre increases profits a lot more than adding an acre to the larger farms. Okay? So that's the first thing it tells us. There are these scale economies. By the way, when you value labor appropriately, farms less than 1 acre are unprofitable, period. Okay? Then if you look at the return to capital equipment, again you find that the return to capital equipment is significantly higher on small farms. Don't be misled, that's bad. Okay, that's the marginal return to capital equipment. It means they're constrained. It means adding an extra rupee of capital equipment would increase their profits. They just can't. Okay? And by the time you get to about 12 acres, it goes down to 0. Now it gets negative because we actually have not subtracted interest rate costs from profits. If you did that appropriately, it would basically go down to 0 at higher levels. Okay? So small farms are constrained in terms of capital relative to large farms. They're under-mechanized. Okay? That's one of the sources for why they have less efficiency, and they pay higher interest costs. Okay? One other thing we show, and I won't have time to show you the details, is the following. A shock to profits in a prior period has no effect on profits in the current period for large farms, but it has a significant effect for small farms. So if a small farm experiences a shortfall in income in a previous year, it shows up in their ability to produce in the next year. But for larger farms, you don't see that. So the larger farms also have, in a sense, better insurance through savings. Okay? That's another source of their efficiency that we see. Okay. What about mechanization? We also show that, not surprisingly, increased scale, they're going to be more mechanized. Okay? And so let me, one more thing, and then a conclusion. Now we're going to take the plot data. So we find these scale effects that seem to overcome the cost advantage on the labor side for small farms. How much of that is purely the mechanization part, and not just the credit part? We're comparing plots across the same farmer of different sizes. Since it's the same farmer, he faces the same credit costs for each of the plots. They're the same. So he has the same capability across those plots. Right? So all that's the same. The only reason there can be more profitability on one plot compared to another, apart from quality, and we have 7 measures of soil quality that we control for, is scale. Okay? So what we show is that in the larger plots, there's significantly higher profits per acre compared to the smaller plots for the same farmer, and the larger plots are much more likely to use a tractor than the smaller plots. It's through mechanization. Moreover, that effect is even stronger to the extent that they're well-functioning mechanization markets or rental markets for equipment. Okay, it's directly related to that. All right, so what is this all? Oh, then we have external validity. Let me show you one last thing. If the distribution of land was efficient in India, the imputed rental price of every piece of land would be the same. That is, adding an acre to a farm of 2 acres or a farm of 20 acres would garner the same reservation rental price. Farmer would be just as much willing to pay the same thing, no matter what land is on. This is what the data suggests is true. That what a farmer will pay for an additional unit of land rises with scale. Smaller farmers, right, would be willing to pay a lot more for land than bigger farmers to try to get the scale economies. Okay? What this predicts is that small farmers are going to basically consolidate through the rental market, right? And that's what we find. Okay, we find reverse tendency, which everyone is aware of in India. It's large farmers not renting land to small farmers, but small farmers renting land to large farmers to get the scale up in the economy. And that's what we see actually in the data. We have the rental markets. Only 10% of farmers are observed, 9% of farmers are observed to rent. Less than 5% of area is rental in this entire data set from all states of India. The rental market's not doing the job. Rental market, 72% of land is rented to family members, not surprisingly, right? You're not going to rent land far away. You're going to rent land that's nearby to try to exploit these scale economies, and nearby land's going to be family land. And so that's basically what's going on. That's a cue to finish.
It is.
All right, so one last statement. What this suggests is that there is a cost to having so many people working in agriculture. If the movement of people out of agriculture is associated with selling land so that the scale of operations increase, agricultural productivity, as these data show, will increase significantly. Okay? In fact, we made a calculation that if you consolidated land holdings to a minimum size of 10 acres, 20% of the labor force from agriculture could exit without a decline in profitability. In fact, with a slight increase in profitability. In some sense, not some sense, there is surplus labor in Indian agriculture. And policies then have to be attentive to seeing to it that people get out of agriculture. That will improve agriculture and probably improve the rest of the economy once these other problems are fixed as well. Okay, let me stop there.
Thank you. We have 2 discussants. First, Abhijit Mahajan.
Okay, so so this is a paper that actually revisits a really old question in development that kind of focused on, if you like, kind of the first 2 pictures that I've shown up here. So the first picture is something that lots of studies found, starting in the 50s, going onwards, which is roughly showing you that if you look at output per acre plotted against land holdings, so plotted against the actual size of the farm owned, you see this sort of negative relationship. So smaller plots seem to be producing more per acre than larger plots. And the second graph is more to do with labor markets, and that sort of says if you sort of measure labor intensity per acre, that seems to also be decreasing with land holdings. So both of these graphs sort of generated a massive literature in early literature, which sort of died out maybe 10, 15 years ago, and the idea was to try and explain what's going on in Indian farms. What is it about land holdings that makes, according to this graph, smaller land holdings produce more output, and what is it about the labor market that makes labor intensity much higher at smaller land holdings? And so what Mark and Andy want to do is to sort of take us away from this literature that sort of got mired in, I think, focusing particularly on output per acre and labor intensity as measures of sort of farm quality or farm outcomes, to think more about what happens to profits. And so sort of what they say is that once you sort of account for all the relevant economic forces, you get a nice upward sloping curve that relates profits per acre to land holdings. Okay, so the big sort of takeaway question from this paper then becomes that if you really believe the results, that you really think there's this strong results relationship between land size and profits, why don't we see more land consolidation in India? So why, given the fact that profits go up by say 9% for every additional acre of land, why are land holdings in India so small? Okay, so I won't have very much to say that about until the end, but that's sort of, I think, in some sense, the big takeaway, if you believe the paper, is sort of there's something going on in the land market that's making these farm holdings be much smaller than they should be, as suggested by these profits. So it's ideally what you'd like to do in order to answer Mark's question is, you'd like to think of each input that goes into, say, farm production. So think of just sort of labor, capital, and land to sort of characterize what they look at. What you'd like to do is you'd like to compute the partial derivative of profits with respect to land, holding capital and labor fixed, right? So what you'd like to do is do some sort of randomized experiment where you randomly provide different plots of land to different people, holding the capital and labor stock fixed, and then the resulting profits, once you've figured out how to cost profits appropriately, tell you exactly how much you should be, how much an extra acre of land is going to contribute to profits. Okay, there's a couple of things. So the thing that, so in actuality, we can't do these randomized experiments. People choose capital and labor as a function of the land that they already have. So just looking at larger farms relative to smaller farms and comparing their output is not necessarily going to give you a credible estimate of how much profits are going to increase when you increase land size. Okay, so that's why you sort of need to go back to a theory of how is it that farmers choose for a given plot of land, how much labor do they choose, how much machinery do they choose, given the plot of land that they actually have. And so that turns out to be sort of the building blocks for this model. And it turns out that they incorporate sort of three key, I'm not sure if you can call them frictions, but three key characteristics of labor and credit markets that are going to drive their results. So the first one is sort of characterized by sort of saying, look, blood is thicker than water, but how do you cost it? And this is sort of the general notion that it's more costly to supervise hired workers than it is to supervise on-family labor. But the question is, how do you exactly attribute the right wage to, your uncle who is supervising weeding on your farm or something like that, right? So that's one issue that's going to arise. The second issue is sort of related to credit markets and the idea that, the more land you have, the easier it is for you to get credit because, the more collateral you can pledge to banks, so the more likely banks are willing to lend to you. And so that's going to push you towards getting more credit when you have larger land sizes. And the third thing that relates your choice of inputs to land size is that mechanization works better when you have larger plots. So, the larger plot you have, the better it is for you to get, one of these bigger harvesters. So these are going to be the three ways in which labor, credit markets, and technology are going to sort of affect how much land you'd want to have. So the first one is the one that's actually going to be if you like, working against you in the sense that, that labor is going to get more expensive the larger land size you have. The other two are sort of all pushing you towards larger land sizes. Okay, so this is telling you something about how much capital and labor, how capital and labor are chosen optimally for a given land size. The other issue is, how is land size chosen? Okay, so that the model doesn't really address, so there's not really an optimal allocation of land size within the model, reflecting the fact that, land markets in India are basically pretty thin. What they need, though, is some way in the model, in the data, to sort of get exogenous variation in land sizes. So sort of, do this, try and sort of, through the model, run this idea of, giving two identical farmers, different land plots. So what they do is they go back to this older paper that they have that was actually explicitly looked at household division and found that sort of there was a substantial amount of change in the amount of land farmers own, most of it coming from household division. So that's then going to be something, if you like, is not part of the theoretical model, but it's sort of a fact in the data that they're going to use to identify the effects of land size on profits. Okay. So the first finding, which is interesting, is basically says that once you cost labor appropriately, once you figure out that it's actually quite expensive to supervise non-family labor, what the authors claim is that basically hired workers are essentially twice as costly as family workers. Okay? So the market wage, as Mark pointed out, is not really the right way to think about costing these two different kinds of labor. And basically, this is a model in which family labor and hired workers are imperfect substitutes for each other. And in fact, hired labor is actually more costly since it needs to be supervised. Okay, so one obvious implication of this is, given constant family size, larger firms are going to require larger labor if they want to just use labor, and so they're going to have higher per unit labor costs.
Or they have larger families.
Or you have larger families, yes. So what this thing is going to do is it's going to force, if you like, larger farms to move away from labor, because their labor actually becomes expensive once you have a large farm. So this is going to be another push that's going to move you towards, say, substituting away from labor towards capital or land. But in this case, we don't have much of a land market. Okay, so what's going to happen is basically you're going to get this substitution towards machines because per unit labor costs are becoming expensive for you as you expand your land size. So you're going to go towards machines just because of the fact that labor is more costly. But there's two additional push factors which make the effect much stronger, right? And this is basically the fact that once you get to a large enough scale, you can start using these very productive harvesters. And once you get to a large enough scale, you can also get loans from banks to buy these harvesters, right? So in addition to the fact that per unit labor costs are rising, these two other factors are going to again push you towards mechanization for larger plots. Right? And so effectively what they find is that for every additional acre of land, you get an extra of about 900 rupees worth of additional investment in equipment. Okay, so that's how capital responds to capital affects land size and mechanization. Okay, so then to go to so now we've looked at how for a given amount of land, labor and capital respond to that amount of land. Now we're going to get to the central point of the paper, which is to once you've figured out how people choose labor and capital optimally for a given amount of land, let's now revisit this question of the relationship between land size and profits. Okay? And again, the usual issue comes up because if we're not running a randomized experiment, what we need to do is find some sort of exogenous variation in the amount of land holding that different farmers have. And what they find again, what they use here is the fact that about a quarter of the farmers in their sample actually changed their land holdings between the two waves of the data, and most of these changes came from household divisions and inheritances. So you did see changes in land holdings. It was just that these were not being carried out in impersonal market exchanges. These were being carried out by households dividing because the head of the household died or something like that. Okay. Once you use this exogenous variation in land holdings and you cost out profits appropriately, taking into account that labor and capital adjust for these changes in land holdings, they find that basically you get an increase in profits of about 9% for every additional acre of land, okay, at the mean. So this is a large number, right? And so this leads to the natural question, basically, if this is the case, why don't we see larger farm sizes, right? So the paper provides very convincing estimates that these are the profits for increasing land size, and so then the bigger question really becomes, why don't we see larger farm sizes? What are the frictions in labor, credit, or other markets that are holding back larger farm sizes? Okay, so as an aside, I have two main comments. My first main comment is that land size changes here in this paper are somewhat different from the land size changes that you'd expect to see in an impersonal market exchange to some extent. These are mostly done between relatives, for example, right? Household division. So the results are probably most relevant for land size changes that are driven by household division. So if you like, or another way to say it is that all of the results are coming from the fact that there's very little unobserved heterogeneity in the model, right? Otherwise, you're going back to some, once you incorporate the heterogeneity, it becomes a little harder to identify the relevant parts of the model. Okay. The other comment I basically has to do with trying to think about why is it that what is it about Indian farms that prevents them from growing larger? And what I want to do is to actually not really provide an answer to that, but to provide a sort of similarity to this question that's been posed with respect to farms, that's been posed with respect to manufacturing also in the Indian context, where sort of the question has been, why do we see why are many Indian firms very small and some Indian firms very large, but you sort of have this missing middle of Indian firms. And what I want to sort of talk about is this study that I did looking at textile firms in India, and these are relatively large firms in the sense they have a turnover of about $10 million, they have about 200, 300 employees. And what we found here again was that this notion of supervisory costs really becomes important when firms are thinking about expanding. Right? So for example, in our data set, it turned out that how many brothers and sons the CEO had was a much better predictor of the size of the firm than how well the firm was run. Right? So this quote we have from one of the CEOs basically asked, when we asked him, why are you thinking of not expanding, or why aren't you expanding your firm? It was, no brothers, no sons. Right? So the idea is that basically any executive position is held by someone within the family. And so then a constraining factor to the expansion of the firm basically becomes the finite amount of time that the CEO and the CEO's family have to expend on the firm itself, right? And unlike Mark's paper, where credit market constraints seem to be important, this is not a case where credit constraints are very important, because these firms are all, on average, these firms are borrowing from banks all the time. They're investing in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So credit constraints aren't really what's holding them back. And these firms are already quite mechanized, and they're taking advantage of these scales of mechanization. So it's not sort of some scale mechanization that's holding them back as well. And so one way to think about this is to say that, maybe what's important, or maybe what's going on with the fact that with land sizes here is that, these supervisory costs or management or whatever, however you want to think about it, the fact that these things are so linked to limited family time is probably, might be one of sort of the ultimate constraints on how large these plots can get. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our other discussant is Radha Singh.
Yeah, well, good afternoon, friends. It was really wonderful to hear Dr. Rosenweg and the comments which were made by Aparjit on the paper that we have. But I am going to take all of you back to the basics as to what Indian agriculture is all about, and how these models and assumptions actually fit into what is ground reality in India and Indian agriculture. Here we are, a country with 329 million hectares of land. We are talking about 16% of the world's population, 4% of the water resources of the world. Agriculture's contribution to GDP, 14.6%, and 60% as of now, Indian population depending on agriculture for its livelihood. The country has the second largest arable land in the world, 160 million hectares, highest arable land to land size ratio, the largest irrigated land network in the world, which is 63 million hectares, and an extremely favorable and diverse agroclimatic condition, which are 16 in number. So, despite the smallness of India's land holdings, and about 85% of them being marginal and small farmers, how do we look on the production scene? Well, let me take you through some of the major commodities of the country. As far as rice is concerned, 95.32 million tons, wheat 85.93. We have coarse cereals, which includes corn, etc., 42.22. And as far as pulses are concerned, which is quite a staple in our country, we are 18.09 million tons. And then, of course, the commodities like cotton, which is extremely important Globally, we are number 2. Jute and Mester, perhaps number 1. And the oilseed is not very positive, but and we are importing as of now regularly, but we are doing a production of 9.95 million. Indian agriculture in the world, by way of percentages, it's all before you. But let me tell you that as far as milk is concerned, the highest producer of milk in the world. Pulses are concerned, the highest producer of pulses in the world. Rice, we are ranking number 2. Groundnuts, number 2. Fruits and vegetables, number 2. Potatoes, number 2. Livestock, cattle, we are number 2, and there it goes on. Cotton number 2, sugarcane number 2, and we have quite a presence internationally in the global market. So, back to basics. Small farmers, yes indeed. Now I think the figure is more like 86% of all Indian farmers are small, marginal, and they are having holdings, believe it or not, as small as 1 to 0.4 hectares, ranging also to 0.4 to 1 hectare. Total operational land holdings are increasing from 71 million. It has jumped up to 128.89 million, which multiplied by a factor of 5, you can imagine the extent of the dependencies. I leave it to you. Farm sizes are shrinking from 1.8 hectares. They are now closer, 1.24 or maybe even lesser. Now, what is the subject of discussion today? The subject, I believe, of our discussion really is farm size, productivity, and livelihoods. Now, as far as that topic is concerned, while Mark did an excellent presentation and Apajit had some very valuable observations to it, the studies that have been conducted in the country from the 1960 onwards, starting with the famous published works of Dr. Sen, we have any amount of literature to show and to prove that there is inverse relationship between farm sizes and productivities / efficiencies. If you are not convinced, and there is time, Mr. Chairman, I could go through the number of literature that we have on this issue, which I'm sure Professor Rosenwig would be well aware of, but I think I will spare all of you the trouble of all those studies that have been conducted to prove that there is indeed an inverse relationship between farm sizes and levels of productivity and efficiency. So, small farms have lower productivity is not quite the storyline in Asia and least of all in India. That farm mechanization is not possible if you do not have large farms is also not borne out by facts. That small farmers are not willing to take risks, highly debatable. Many of them indeed have shown that they have gone for the latest technology, BT cotton being the latest case in point where the smallest of farmers have gone in for that kind of a technology. And lastly, that land leasing is not allowed in India. So what is it that contributes to the efficiency which I was talking about insofar as the small farms are concerned? While it is true that the smallness of the farms do not permit the owning of large-scale machinery and equipment, but you will be surprised to note the extent of custom hiring that is happening of these farm implements and that is all across board. Somebody's taken away my water. Okay. Number two, that there has been, thank you. Number two, that there has been an increased, enhanced penetration of the public sector and the private sector banks, and so therefore credit is not really such a major issue as is being made out insofar as small farms are concerned. Number three, that small farms indeed adopt enhancing technologies, and you can see via the slide the extent of the adoption of these high-yielding varieties in farms which are marginal, having the highest percentage of the HYVs, followed by the small semi-farm. In fact, the large farms come much below them. As far as the irrigated areas are concerned, you will see that the marginal farms have the highest level of irrigation, followed by the small, and so on and so forth. So, fertilizer consumption, higher in the marginal, small, semi-medium, and medium farms. As far as irrigation is concerned, it's same and similar. How about cropping intensities? Highest among the marginal farmers, to be followed by the small and the semi-medium farmers. In fact, the case is so strong insofar as the inverse relationship is concerned that there's a lot of argument in the country why farms should not be further subdivided and holdings made smaller, because the levels of productivity and efficiency which are being shown prove that, in fact, small farmers are more efficient than the larger ones. And this gives you a view of the use of equipment, machinery by the small farm holdings. There's a greater use of farm power by the smaller farms. Even the insurance coverage, I think it's much better, as you would have seen in the slide, than the larger farms. How much time do I have?
We're running behind. So
Oh, are we?
yes, we are.
Oh. So let me just skip. Now, if we compare, and I don't think any debate is complete without comparing ourselves with China, that the farm sizes in China, indeed, Japan, Korea, are as small, if not smaller, than India. But then what else is the difference? The difference is that their productivity levels are definitely double, if not triple, of what we have. And therefore, the game changer really is that we need to have improved research, progressive technology adoption, and separable resources for farming communities who can invest. Many say that, well, India's farmers or the people in the rural hinterland should exit farming. I can tell you that however small the farms are, the farmers will continue to stay on the land because of cultural factors. There are no major shifts in livelihoods, and because of the integrated farming practices that they adopt. So, well, I think the steps forward for us, I mean, it is true that the farms are efficient, but what is happening really is that the per capita income is very low because of the high levels of dependency that you have on these small farms. These are two distinct things. The first argument was that small farms are not efficient. We beg to differ on that one because we do feel that small farms are indeed efficient. But what is the causal factor of the levels of poverty and deprivation that we see among people holding these small holdings is that there is just too much dependency on land, and therefore the per capita income accruing out of that holding is indeed too small. So the answer really is that you increase productivity and you adopt technologies that give you much higher inputs, add value, and this slide will indicate for you how we need to be going about doing our farming. There are any number of very innovative exercises having been done in India. The question and the challenge before us is to actually scale these up. These are all by private entrepreneurs who have gone and directly contacted with a large number of farmers, and the results are before you to see how they have built scale through contract farming and through leasing to get the results that they've gotten. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are running a little bit behind, but we do have time for a few comments. Let me just, if I may, just say something very brief. I read the paper and I learned a great deal from it. I don't think of it in terms of are small farms efficient or not. Because efficiency is in fact presumed a lot in some of the methods here. It's comparative efficiency. It's not are they not efficient, it's how does their efficiency compare with the efficiency of larger farms. If I were the referee of this paper, and I'm not, but if I were, I would ask for, the key variable here is profits. And I would ask, and that is a constructed variable. It's constructed from other ingredients that have been explained. And I think it's courageous to assume that that constructed variable is measured without error. And it's on the left-hand side of his key relationships. And if, in fact, the errors are distributed randomly, then that's not a problem. Well, it affects results, but it won't bias the coefficients. It will cause our confidence in the estimates to be less. But I fear that it's not, in fact, distributed randomly, this error, and that it may be, in fact, correlated with the size variable that is so important to their analysis. But other than that, I thought this was a professional, well-done paper on a very important topic. Let's have a few comments. Andrew.
So this is actually linked to both Mark's presentation and to Apajit's comments. So the basic result is that large farms are much more profitable per acre than our small farms. And Apajit raised a question, well, then we should see this small farms be consolidating to large farms, and why aren't we seeing that? I sort of see it a little bit differently. And you discussed manufacturing. And there the issue really is, why don't firms grow while they're expanding? In agriculture, the difference is that you're not thinking of the farms growing. The question you should be asking is, why are farms operationally divided? Okay, the main way that the farms are coming down is because of inheritance. So the father is making a decision to divide the farm. The two brothers are making a decision to operate separately, even if for some reasons they own separately, because there are much larger profits to be made from operating the farms together. They should be operating them jointly and then getting a much larger profit. So that seems to be the real issue, and then it comes down to, is it really supervision costs? And it seems that the real agency problems then are agency problems within the family market. That has to be the explanation for why the two farmers are not operating jointly. So that's another way of looking at it. The other thing that also could have happened is if the profits per acre, profits on whole, are much larger for the combined farm, for the father's farm, the other thing he could always have done is sold that farm, realized the capitalized value of that land, divided that, and each of the sons would have been better off. So again, the question is then, what is the failure there, that is not being the method that is pursued?
All right, thank you. Professor Kruger.
Thank you. I want to go on the other side of it, namely, why don't the farmers move? And it seems to me that there are the capital market imperfections, which may be why people don't sell, because the market is not there, and land restrictions as well. But there are also problems on the industrial side. In most countries, of course, what has happened is that unskilled labor-intensive manufacturing has been a leading growth sector, creating opportunities in the urban areas. And in India, for a variety of reasons, India is the one country that has been growing without that increasing share of unskilled labor-intensive manufacturing. And the reasons for that are things we've discussed before in these seminars, but I would have thought that, on the supply side, you might have people willing to move if they thought they could find something in the urban areas, but when urban jobs are not increasing very rapidly, why would you move off the farm? You've got a livelihood there, you may not have it in the city, and I would have thought that that was at least a part of the answer.
Yeah, my first question, you mentioned about you adjust the family members, like male, females, and so forth. And I assume that in India also some of the kids also are helpers. So how do you adjust them? Times 0.3 of a male or something like that? Because it could be quite sensitive to the bottom line, as John talked about. Especially for the small farm, because the family percentage of family member could be quite high, and that's a very sensitive factor. Another one is you mentioned and talk about the opportunity cost. Say if that's a urbanization, such like China's township and village enterprises, then people might have more incentive or opportunity to move away. And I don't know whether you can. For the future project, can have take that into account in some area that's going to urbanize. And another factor is the government subsidy. I don't know, because the government heavily subsidizes the industry, the agriculture, and I don't know to whose benefit, more to the small size farm or more to the large farm. And without government subsidy, what would be the likely outcome in the landscape? Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, this question to Mark. In terms of how dated is this paper, because a fairly fundamental shift has taken place in the last 3 years with the introduction of the Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which has very significantly increased the cost of labor. And the extent of substitution which this would induce between capital and labor on the one hand, and within the labor, the substitution on a preference to family labor versus hired labor. Because I think that the dynamics of this needs to be really worked out, because this is a fairly fundamental shift in terms of a new rigidity is being introduced in the labor market.
Was there another? Yes.
I would also like to support this view. And in recent years, agricultural wages have gone up a lot. But I would think that it only strengthens the argument, because as the wages go up, there are better benefits from mechanization. And we see tractor sales in the last 2 years going up quite steeply. I also feel that people are not moving off the farm because of the lack of opportunities. And I think the way things are going in India, it's equally likely that they'll go into services. And there are actually a lot of BPOs looking to be set up, some of them as social ventures, some of them as business ventures, setting up in rural areas, trying to provide service jobs in rural areas. So this may be an area of movement. And this is just anecdotal evidence, but only in the last 2 or 3 years have we heard of, I've heard that in Punjab there are engineers going into farming. They are buying up or leasing land, and the entire model is around this consolidation. So perhaps there is a lack of skill in consolidating that is slowing down this process. And once consolidators get into the market, it might speed things up.
Well, my understanding is the data are, in fact, what, from 1999 to 2008? 2007. Well, so, well, anyway, there are two other brief comments. Professor Kruger again. Oh, no? Oh, it was up. In the back, yes.
I'm thinking of, when I hear this, a paper, a very old paper by Robert Lucas, where he actually describes that the distribution of firm size in a country is a reflection or a function of leadership ability or management skills. And that's exactly what you hinted towards. We might not have the ability going from managing a small firm to a big firm for different reasons. And I just wanted to know if there was some knowledge about this. What do we need for this to happen? I'm just curious. I'm from a country, Sweden, and we have a similar problem, having very many small firms and very big, huge firms. And in between, it's a void. Maybe for other reasons than...
All right, well, thank you. Oh, there's one more, sorry. Very quick. Okay, all right, very quick, good.
So I guess I wondered in the paper, Mark, if it was possible, is it possible to come up with the answer in terms of what is the optimum farm size? And what would that number be? Because looking at some of the graphs, it seemed to be around 17 acres. Looking at other graphs, there seemed to be an inflection point at 12 or something. Yeah. So 10 or 12. 10 or 12, okay. And then the second question actually has to do with, well, in industry, we measure efficiency or productivity increasingly by looking at total factor productivity. So coming back to John's comment earlier on, that why can't we do that in agriculture? Why do we use this profit surrogate instead? Is there any way of getting at total factor productivity in agriculture? I mean, this might be...
There's the final comment. Yes.
Just have a small one.
Sorry. In this entire discussion, I mean, I just wanted to put in a new input to try and consider much of these issues of productivity and growth of Indian agriculture. The Indian government brings out a thing called the Economic Survey every year. And the Economic Survey for 2010-11 informs us that between 2005 and 6 and 2010 and 11, the rate of growth, the growth rate of investment in agriculture fell from 13.9% to 3.4%. Now, all these issues of farm size, productivity, etc., are relevant. I'm not going into those issues concerned. But unless you consider the overall macro picture of investments in agriculture, I think much of this discussion would not be complete. I think it'll be very inadequate unless you take into the question of investments in agriculture. Thank you.
Okay. Lunch awaits us, but Mark should be permitted to make some remarks to the comments that he's been given.
Well, because we don't want to delay lunch. So one of the purposes of the paper is, in fact, a direct discussion to the issue of why there are so many people in rural areas and why they're not getting out. And also to show that, as was said, if you believe these results, what the cost is for India. And I think that's happening. Let me then respond to just a few of the things. So the rural employment scheme is important. Our latest round doesn't quite capture it, but I agree with the point that that's going to be a force for mechanization as well, and for trying to conserve on labor, and that's going to be one of the presumably unintended consequences of this program. I agree with that. I also tend to agree with Ann. If I were looking at the major reason why there are too many people in agriculture, it's precisely because this major feature of Indian development that's so different from every other place, and the rate of urbanization being so much lower given the speed of development compared to any other place, is this hole in this development process of the lack of good, low-skill manufacturing jobs that we see in China. The other questions are kind of small. The data are really good. So the issue about the how do you combine kids and female?
That's okay, just leave it right there. That's fine.
Okay, just put it there? Okay, combining kids and women. The data actually ask by operation, what are the relative productivities of kids and males and females, so that we actually use those weights. You can compare those weights to the actual wage rates, which are also given for children, kids, and for children and males and females by operation, and they more or less correspond. So the data are actually really good for computing, and it's not based on any arbitrary fraction, and they do differ by operation and that sort of thing. So in terms of Angini's comment that it's why doesn't, and we've thought about this, so why doesn't the two brothers, one sell out to the other, right? Let the more efficient brother farm. And I think it is because what does the farmer who sells out do with his proceeds? That's a capital market issue. Where do you put the money from the proceeds of the farm, even if you could come up with the capital to buy out your brother? And secondly, what would he do with his life? And without these manufacturing jobs and without as secure a capital investment as land, it's not obvious why it is obvious to me that it's not obvious that they should one should sell out versus the other. So it still is a development, fundamentally a development problem. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Nick, what is lunch?